My family locked me in the basement, calling me useless. But when I found grandfather's secret files and he called from his penthouse, they discovered their betrayal would cost them everything they had. I'm Charlotte Hayes, 28 years old, and the night they locked me in that basement changed everything. The metal door slammed shut with a sound that still echoes in my nightmares. My cousin Victoria's laughter filtered through the wooden floorboards above me, mixing with my Aunt Melissa's shrill voice instructing someone to make sure the lock was secure. "She's finally where she belongs," Victoria said, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. In the dark, with the rest of the trash, this wasn't some dramatic movie scene. This was Tuesday night, September 12th, in the Hayes family estate where I'd lived since my parents died in a car accident when I was 7 years old. The same house where my grandfather, William Hayes, had built his fortune from nothing. The same house where his children, my Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard, had raised their own families while I existed in the shadows, the orphaned burden they were obligated to keep. The basement wasn't some horror movie dungeon. It was finished, with concrete floors and metal shelving units holding Christmas decorations and old furniture, but it was windowless, cold, and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling created more shadows than illumination. They'd thrown me down here with nothing but the clothes on my back, a thin cardigan that did nothing against the October chill seeping through the walls. Why did they lock me down here? Because I dared to question Victoria about the inheritance. Grandfather William had been in the hospital for 3 weeks, and suddenly there were whispers about his will, about property transfers, about accounts being moved. When I asked Victoria why she was meeting with lawyers without telling grandfather, she'd smiled that cold smile I'd learned to fear. "You really think you have any right to question me?" she'd said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen. "You're not even really family, Charlotte. You're just the charity case my parents took in. Grandfather's money has nothing to do with you." I'd opened my mouth to argue, to remind her that grandfather William had always treated me differently than the others, had always made time to talk to me about his business when I was younger, before Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard had forbidden those conversations. But before I could speak, Victoria had called for her brother Marcus. Marcus was 32, built like he spent every free moment at the gym, and he'd grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises that would purple by morning. Aunt Melissa had appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression blank as her son dragged me toward the basement door. "You've become ungrateful," my aunt had said, her voice flat. "After everything we've done for you, given you a home, food, a place to sleep, and this is how you repay us? By making accusations and causing trouble?" I wasn't accusing anyone, I'd tried to explain, my voice shaking. "I just asked a question about grandfather's will because I'm worried about him, and the slap had come so fast I'd barely registered it before my cheek was burning." Aunt Melissa had never struck me before. Years of cold indifference, yes. Years of making me feel invisible, absolutely, but never physical violence. "Down to the basement," she'd ordered Marcus. "Let her think about respect and gratitude." That had been 6 hours ago. I'd tried the door exactly 47 times. I'd counted. The lock was solid, probably newly installed based on how smoothly it clicked. They'd planned this. The realization sat heavy in my stomach like spoiled food. My phone was upstairs in my room, conveniently out of reach. The basement had no landline, no way to call for help. I'd screamed until my throat was raw, but the house was large enough that the nearest neighbors wouldn't hear, and even if they did, they'd probably assume it was a television or some family argument they didn't want involvement in. I sat on the cold concrete floor, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to think. There had to be a reason they'd escalated to this level of cruelty. Victoria's meeting with lawyers, Aunt Melissa's sudden nervousness whenever grandfather's condition was mentioned, Uncle Richard's constant phone calls where he'd step outside and speak in hushed tones. They were planning something they didn't want me to know about. Grandfather William had always been different with me. While Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard treated me like an obligation, grandfather had treated me like I mattered. When I was 12, he'd taught me about his business, explaining investments and property management in ways that made sense to my young mind. When I was 16, he'd helped me apply to colleges, promising he'd make sure I got the education I deserved. But then something had changed. Aunt Melissa had forbidden those private conversations. She'd told grandfather that I was getting ideas above my station, and that it was inappropriate for him to treat me like I was actually part of the family inheritance. Grandfather had argued with her. I'd heard them through the walls, but eventually he'd stopped calling me into his study for our talks. I'd tried to stay invisible after that, to not cause problems. I'd gotten a job at a local bookstore to pay for my own things, had moved into the smallest bedroom in the house without complaint, had learned to eat dinner in my room to avoid the tension at family meals. I'd told myself it was temporary, that once I saved enough money I could move out and start my own life away from the Hayes family drama. But here I was, 28 years old and locked in a basement because I'd dared to ask a question about my own grandfather's well-being. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting on the cold floor, and began searching the basement more thoroughly. The shelving units held boxes labeled in my aunt's precise handwriting. Christmas ornaments, winter clothes, old kitchen supplies. I opened a few, finding nothing useful except a flashlight with dead batteries and some moth-eaten blankets that smelled like mothballs. Behind a stack of boxes in the far corner, I found something interesting. An old wooden filing cabinet, the kind with multiple drawers that locked with a single key. It was dusty enough that it clearly hadn't been touched in years, pushed back against the wall and hidden by the holiday decorations. I tried the drawers. The top 3 were locked solid, but the bottom drawer, the largest one, had a lock that wiggled when I pulled on it. The mechanism was old, probably original to the cabinet, which looked like it was from the 1970s or 80s. I searched through nearby boxes until I found an old wire hanger in a box of cleaning supplies. It took me 20 minutes of careful manipulation, my fingers cramped cramping and the wire cutting into my palm, but finally the lock clicked open. The drawer slid out with a screech of metal on metal that made me freeze, listening for footsteps above. Nothing. They probably couldn't hear anything down here anyway. The drawer was full of manila folders, each one labeled in handwriting I recognized immediately. Grandfather William's distinctive scrawl, the letters tilting slightly to the right, the capital letters oversized compared to the rest. My heart started pounding as I pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Property Holdings, 1995 to 2005. Inside were deeds, transfer documents, property assessments. I recognized some of the addresses. The Hayes family estate where we currently lived, a commercial building downtown that housed several businesses, a vacation home in the mountains that I'd visited exactly once when I was 9 years old. But there were other properties I didn't recognize. Apartment buildings, retail spaces, undeveloped land parcels, page after page of assets, all documented meticulously in grandfather's careful handwriting with notes about purchase prices, current values, rental income. I pulled out another folder. This one was labeled Trust Documents, Charlotte Marie Hayes. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped the papers. Charlotte Marie Hayes, my full name. Why would there be a folder about me hidden in this basement filing cabinet? I opened it with trembling fingers. The first document was dated March 23, 2003, just 3 months after my parents' death. It was a trust agreement, the legal language dense and difficult to parse, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Establish irrevocable trust for the benefit of Charlotte Marie Hayes, to be funded with properties including, but not limited to, distributions to begin upon Charlotte's 25th birthday or upon the death of the grantor, whichever comes first. In the event that Charlotte is prevented from accessing these funds by interference from family members, alternative provisions. I had to read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. Grandfather William had created a trust for me, not just a small nest egg, but an actual trust funded with real properties, and I was supposed to have started receiving money from it 3 years ago when I turned 25. I'd never received a single cent, never even knew the trust existed. My hands moved frantically through the rest of the folder. Property deeds with my name on them, bank statements showing accounts I'd never accessed, tax documents for properties I'd never known I owned. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual rental income, properties worth millions. I owned apartment buildings. I owned commercial real estate. I owned land that had been in the Hayes family for generations. And I'd been living in the smallest bedroom of the family estate, working retail to pay for my own clothes because no one had ever told me. No, not just hadn't told me, had actively hidden it from me. I pulled out more folders. One was labeled Family Correspondence, Confidential. Inside were letters, emails printed on paper, handwritten notes. Most were between Grandfather William and lawyers, but some were between Grandfather and Aunt Melissa. One letter, dated just 2 years ago, made my blood run cold. Melissa, Grandfather had written in his shaky, elderly handwriting, I've discovered that Charlotte has not been receiving her trust distributions as specified in the original documents. The accounts show withdrawals, but when I called Charlotte to discuss the properties, she had no knowledge of them. I demand an immediate explanation and full accounting of where these funds have gone. If you cannot provide satisfactory answers, I will be forced to take legal action to protect Charlotte's interests. Aunt Melissa's response was paperclipped to the letter. Her typed reply was cold and calculating. Father, Charlotte is not mature enough to handle such responsibility. The funds are being managed appropriately for her benefit. She lives in your house rent-free, eats food we provide, and has everything she needs. The trust income is simply covering those expenses and being saved for her future. When she's ready, we'll discuss it with her. Until then, I think it's best if you don't worry her with complicated financial matters. You know how fragile she is. Fragile. She'd called me fragile. I'd worked 2 jobs through college. I'd put myself through night classes to get my degree. I'd survived years of their cold indifference and subtle cruelty. But sure, I was fragile. I kept reading, my anger building with each document. More letters from Grandfather demanding information. More deflections from Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard. Then, 6 months ago, the tone of the correspondence changed. Grandfather's handwriting became shakier, his letters shorter, and Aunt Melissa's responses became more aggressive. Father, you're not well. These paranoid accusations need to stop. Charlotte is fine. She's happy with her simple life. Not everyone needs to be wealthy to be content. Besides, the trust documents were always meant to be flexible based on circumstances. We're her guardians until you're gone, and we're making decisions in her best interest. Guardians. I was 28 years old. I hadn't needed guardians for a decade. The last letter in the folder was from Grandfather, dated 3 weeks ago, right before he'd ended up in the hospital. His handwriting was barely legible, but the message was clear. Melissa and Richard, I'm changing my will. I've contacted my lawyers, and I'm making sure Charlotte gets everything she's legally entitled to. No more excuses, no more delays. When I die, she gets it all. The trust, the properties, everything. You've had your inheritance already. This is for her. And if anything happens to me before I can finalize these changes, I've left instructions with my lawyer to investigate. Charlotte deserves the truth. My grandfather had been trying to protect me, and then he'd mysteriously ended up in the hospital with what Aunt Melissa had described as a sudden decline. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers that proved years of betrayal, when I heard something above me. Not footsteps, a phone ringing, the old landline that Grandfather had insisted on keeping, the one with the loud bell that could be heard throughout the entire house. It rang 4 times, 5, 6, then stopped. A moment later, I heard Aunt Melissa's voice, muffled through the floorboards, but definitely there. She sounded agitated, then silence. Then, impossibly, the phone in the basement started ringing. I hadn't even known there was a phone down here. I followed the sound to to a wall-mounted unit half hidden behind a stack of boxes, covered in dust. It was an extension of the main landline, probably installed decades ago and forgotten. I grabbed the receiver. Hello? Charlotte? The voice was weak but unmistakable. Grandfather William. Charlotte, is that you? Grandfather. My voice cracked. Where are you? Are you okay? I'm at my penthouse, he said, coughing slightly. The one downtown I never told Melissa about. I left the hospital 3 days ago. They don't know. Charlotte, I tried calling your cell phone, but you're not answering. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't have much time. I'm locked in the basement, I said quickly. Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard locked me down here because I asked about your will. Grandfather, I found the files. I found everything. The trust, the properties, the letters, what they've been doing. I know, he interrupted, his voice strengthening with anger. I know what they've been doing, and I've been collecting evidence. Charlotte, I need you to get out of that basement and get to my penthouse. The address is 427 Park Avenue, penthouse suite. I've called the police to do a welfare check on you at the estate. They should be there within the hour. When they let you out, you come straight here. Bring those files you found. We're going to fix this. But how did you know? Because I've been watching them for months. I installed cameras in the house after I started suspecting they were stealing from you. I know they locked you in that basement. I have video evidence. And Charlotte, there's something else. Something about your parents' accident. Something they don't want you to know. My parents' accident. The car crash that had killed them when I was 7. The accident that had never quite made sense to me, even as a child. My father had been the most careful driver, always following every traffic law, always maintaining his car meticulously. But the police report had said he'd lost control on a clear day on a straight road. What about the accident? I whispered. Not over the phone, Grandfather said. Get here as soon as you can. And Charlotte, don't tell them where you're going. Don't trust anyone in that house. Promise me. I promise. Good girl. The police should be there soon. Oh, and Charlotte, all those properties in the trust, they're just the beginning. Your father was my business partner, not just my son-in-law. He owned 49% of my entire empire. When he died, that share was supposed to go to you. Melissa and Richard have been managing it on your behalf for 21 years. Every cent they've spent, every property they've sold, every decision they've made, they're going to have to account for all of it. The line went dead just as I heard sirens approaching the house. 49%. I owned 49% of the Hayes business empire, and my aunt and uncle had been stealing from me for more than 2 decades. The betrayal was so massive, so complete, that I couldn't fully process it. But I didn't need to process it. I just needed to get out of this basement, get to Grandfather's penthouse, and make them pay for everything they'd done. The sirens grew louder. I heard shouting upstairs, Aunt Melissa's voice raised in protest, someone demanding to know where I was. I gathered all the files, every single folder in that filing cabinet, and held them close to my chest. This was my ammunition. This was my proof. And when I walked out of this basement, I was walking out as Charlotte Hayes, majority shareholder and rightful heir, not the useless orphan they'd tried to make me believe I was. The basement door flew open, and a police officer appeared at the top of the stairs, his flashlight sweeping across the room until it found me sitting on the floor surrounded by decades of hidden truth. Miss Hayes, he called down. Are you hurt? No, I replied, my voice steady despite everything. But we need to talk about kidnapping charges and financial fraud. And officer, you're going to want to bring more units. This is going to be a long night. The officer's name was Detective Michael Rivera, and he took one look at the files clutched in my arms before his expression shifted from concern to intensely focused. He helped me up the stairs, his hand steady on my elbow, and I emerged from that basement into chaos. Aunt Melissa stood in the hallway, her face pale beneath her expensive makeup, hands twisting together in a gesture I'd never seen from her before. She always projected perfect control, but now she looked like someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble. Uncle Richard was on his phone, pacing back and forth, his voice low and urgent. Victoria sat on the living room couch, arms crossed, her expression defiant, even as another officer stood nearby taking notes. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. I learned later he'd tried to leave through the back door the moment the police arrived and was currently being detained outside. Charlotte, Aunt Melissa began, stepping toward me with her hands outstretched like she was approaching a frightened animal. Sweetheart, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect you from yourself. You've been so stressed lately, saying strange things, and we thought some time alone to calm down would help. Stop talking, Detective Rivera interrupted, his voice flat. Ma'am, we received a call about an adult being held against her will in a locked basement. That's kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it. Aunt Melissa's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes stayed locked on the folders in my arms. She knew what I'd found. The panic in her expression confirmed it. Miss Hayes, Detective Rivera said to me, we need to take your statement. Can you tell me what happened tonight? I told him everything. Victoria's lawyer meetings, my questions about Grandfather's condition, Marcus dragging me to the basement, Aunt Melissa's slap, the 6 hours locked in the dark. As I spoke, I watched my aunt's face cycle through emotions. Denial, anger, calculation, fear. Those are private family documents, Uncle Richard said suddenly, pointing at the files. She had no right to go through them. That's that. Actually, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, according to these documents, I'm the legal owner of most of the Hayes family assets. So technically, you're the ones who've been stealing for 21 years. Uncle Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. That's ridiculous. Those are outdated papers, probably from when your grandfather wasn't in his right mind. You can't possibly think, I interrupted, that my grandfather called me 15 minutes ago from his penthouse at 427 Park Avenue, the penthouse you don't know about. He told me he has video evidence of everything that's happened tonight, including you locking me in that basement. He also mentioned something about fraud, embezzlement, and some interesting questions about my parents' car accident. The room went silent. Aunt Melissa swayed on her feet feet like she might faint. Victoria's defiant expression finally cracked, replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. Your parents' accident, Aunt Melissa whispered. Charlotte, you don't understand what you're suggesting. That was a tragedy, a terrible accident. How dare you imply? I'm not implying anything, I said, yet, but I'm very interested in why my grandfather thinks there's something worth investigating about a car crash that happened 21 years ago. And I'm even more interested in why that suggestion makes you look like you're about to be sick. Detective Rivera was watching this exchange with intense interest. Miss Hayes, did your grandfather indicate he had evidence of any crimes beyond tonight's incident? He said he's been collecting evidence for months. He has cameras installed in this house that they don't know about. And he has documentation about a trust fund that was established for me when I was 7 years old. A trust fund that I was supposed to start receiving distributions from when I turned 25. 3 years ago. Money I've never seen. Those funds were used for your benefit, Aunt Melissa said quickly. Your room, your food, your education. My education that I paid for myself with student loans and 2 part-time jobs? I asked. That education? The one where you told me the family couldn't afford to help me because times were tight? Meanwhile, according to these documents, my trust was generating over $200,000 a year in rental income alone. Victoria stood up from the couch. This is insane. Dad, call our lawyer. She's making accusations she can't possibly prove. Actually, Detective Rivera said, pulling out his radio, I think we need to take everyone down to the station to sort this out, and someone needs to contact whoever's investigating financial crimes in this jurisdiction, because this sounds like it's beyond a simple family dispute. The next 3 hours were a blur of police stations, interview rooms, and lawyers. Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard immediately invoked their right to counsel and refused to say anything else. Victoria tried to claim she knew nothing about any financial irregularities, that she was just an innocent daughter caught in the middle. Marcus, still detained outside when the police arrived, insisted he was just following his mother's orders. I sat in a small room with Detective Rivera and gave my statement, documenting everything I could remember about the night, about grandfather's phone call, about the years of subtle cruelty and isolation. When I mentioned that grandfather had said something about my parents' accident, Detective Rivera's partner, a woman named Detective Sarah Chen, exchanged a meaningful look with him. Miss Hayes, Detective Chen said carefully, your parents' accident was investigated at the time and ruled accidental. But if your grandfather has new information, we should definitely look into it. However, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you want to open this particular door? Sometimes old wounds are better left alone. My parents died when I was 7 years old, I said, meeting her eyes. I was told it was an accident, a tragic twist of fate. But if it wasn't, if someone did something that caused their death, then yes, I absolutely want that door opened. They deserve justice, even after 21 years. Detective Chen nodded slowly. All right, we'll contact your grandfather and see what he has. In the meantime, you're free to go. But Miss Hayes, I strongly advise you not to return to your aunt and uncle's home tonight. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay? I'm going to my grandfather's penthouse. Good, we'll need to speak with him as well. But given his age and health condition, we can arrange to do that at his residence. Here's my card. Call me if you remember anything else, or if anyone from your family tries to contact you. They released me just after midnight. I stood outside the police station with my folders of evidence, my thin cardigan doing nothing against the cold October wind, and called a taxi. I couldn't afford an Uber on my bookstore salary, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I was supposedly worth millions, but I had $23 in my checking account. The taxi driver didn't speak much during the 20-minute drive to grandfather's address, which suited me fine. I spent the time looking through the files again, finding new horrors with each page I turned. Property sales where my signature had been forged, trust distributions that had been diverted to accounts I'd never authorized, tax returns filed in my name showing income I'd never received. The building at 427 Park Avenue was the kind of place I'd walked past 1,000 times without thinking I'd ever enter. Modern glass and steel with a doorman in a uniform and a lobby that looked like something from an architecture magazine. The doorman, whose name tag read James, looked at me skeptically until I mentioned William Hayes and the penthouse. Miss Charlotte, he said, his expression transforming into welcome. Mr. Hayes said you'd be coming. He's been waiting for you. I'll take you right up. The private elevator required a key, which James used to send me directly to the penthouse floor. The doors opened onto a small foyer with only one door, which swung open before I could knock. Grandfather William looked smaller than I remembered, his frame thin beneath an expensive robe, his hair completely white now instead of the gray I recalled from my childhood. But his eyes were sharp and clear as he pulled me into a hug that smelled like the cologne he'd worn for as long as I'd known him. Charlotte, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank God. When I saw them lock you in that basement on the camera feed, I thought I might have a heart attack before the police got there. Come in, come in. We have so much to discuss. The penthouse was stunning in an understated way. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, comfortable furniture that looked actually lived in, and walls covered with photos I'd never seen before. Photos of my parents when they were young, before I was born. Photos of me as a baby that I didn't know existed. Photos of a family I'd never been allowed to be part of. Sit, grandfather said, gesturing to a leather couch. I'll make tea. Or do you want something stronger? God knows you've earned it after tonight. Tea is fine, I said, still clutching my folders. Grandfather, what is all this? The penthouse, the cameras in the house, the things you said about my parents' accident. What's happening? He settled into a chair across from me with a heavy sigh. What's happening is that I've been a foolish old man who trusted the wrong people and waited too long to fix his mistakes. Your Aunt Melissa and Uncle Richard have been stealing from you since the day your parents died. And I've spent the last last year trying to gather enough evidence to prove it without tearing the family apart. But tonight, when they locked you in that basement, I realized there was no family left to protect. They killed that themselves. Killed, I repeated. Grandfather, you said something about my parents' accident. What did you mean? He was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he poured tea. Your father, David, was my business partner. He wasn't just my son-in-law. He was the smartest businessman I ever met. We built the Hayes empire together, him and me. When you were born, we revised all our documents to ensure you'd be taken care of. If anything happened to David, his share of the business would go into a trust for you, managed by trustees until you turned 25. The trust I found in the basement. Yes, but Charlotte, there's more. 3 weeks before the accident, David discovered something. He came to me with evidence that Melissa and Richard had been embezzling from the company. Small amounts at first, then larger as they got older. David wanted to go to the police immediately, but I begged him to let me handle it internally, to give them a chance to make it right. Family, you know, always family first. He took a shaky sip of his tea. David agreed to wait, but he started documenting everything. Every missing dollar, every fake invoice, every forged signature. He kept it all in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, downtown branch. He told me the night before the accident that he had enough evidence to put them in prison, and if they didn't return the money and resign from the company within 24 hours, he was going to the authorities. My hands had gone numb, and then he died, and then he died. Him and your mother both, on a perfectly clear day on a straight stretch of road. The police said it was a mechanical failure, something about the brake lines. The car was totaled, the investigation was brief, and everyone was so focused on the tragedy that no one asked too many questions, except me. I've been asking questions for 21 years. You think they killed my parents? I said. The words felt unreal coming out of my mouth. I think it's a remarkable coincidence that David was about to expose their crimes and then died in a mechanical failure that just happened to occur the next morning. I think it's remarkable that Melissa immediately volunteered to take you in, to care for you, and manage your inheritance until you were old enough. I think it's remarkable that every time I tried to get involved in your trust management, Melissa had reasons why it wasn't a good idea, why you weren't ready, why I should let her handle it. He reached into a folder on the side table and pulled out a thick envelope. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator, former detective, specializes in cold cases. I told him about my suspicions, gave him access to all the financial records I could get my hands on, and asked him to dig into the accident. Charlotte, he found things that the original investigation missed or ignored. What things? The mechanic who serviced your father's car the day before the accident was Richard's college roommate. They're still friends, still in contact. The insurance payout for the accident went partially to Melissa and Richard as your guardians, supposedly to help with your care. That money disappeared into their personal accounts, none of it ever spent on you. And the safety deposit box where David kept his evidence? Melissa had it opened 3 days after the funeral, claiming she was next of kin and needed to access important documents. Everything inside was destroyed. I felt like I was falling, like the expensive penthouse floor had disappeared beneath me. They murdered my parents for money. I can't prove it, grandfather said, and his voice broke. Not yet. The evidence is circumstantial, the connections are thin. That's why I've been building a case, collecting documentation, installing cameras, recording conversations. I needed enough to not just accuse them, but to bury them. And tonight, when they locked you in that basement and I had video evidence of kidnapping, I realized I finally had my opening. He handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of bank statements, emails between Richard and the mechanic, photographs of documents that had clearly been taken secretly. It was damning, suggestive, horrifying. But he was right. It wasn't quite enough for murder charges. The police are going to investigate now, I said. They have to. After tonight. Detective Rivera and Detective Chen seemed competent. They are. I've already contacted them, sent them digital copies of everything my investigator found. They're reopening the case into your parents' deaths as of tonight. But Charlotte, I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. Melissa and Richard will fight with everything they have. They'll hire expensive lawyers. They'll try to discredit you and me. They'll claim we're senile or vindictive or making things up. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the basement, about the years of feeling invisible, about my parents who I barely remembered, but whose absence had shaped my entire life. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. Good. Because tomorrow morning we're meeting with my lawyers and we're taking back everything they stole, every property, every account, every single cent, and then we're going to make sure they spend the rest of their lives behind bars. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning. Grandfather sharing details I'd never known about my parents, about the business they'd built, about the life I should have had. He showed me documents that proved I owned not just properties, but shares in dozens of companies, investments in tech startups that had made fortunes, real estate holdings across 3 states. You're worth approximately $18 million, grandfather said, give or take a few million depending on current property values. Your father was brilliant with investments, and even with Melissa and Richard stealing for 2 decades, they couldn't drain it all. They tried, believe me, but the trust was structured in ways that protected the principal, allowed the assets to grow. They could steal the income, but they couldn't touch the core holdings without my signature, and I never gave it. $18 million. I'd been working at a bookstore for $12 an hour, worried about making rent on a shared apartment, while I was worth $18 million. Tomorrow, grandfather continued, my lawyers will file for an emergency hearing to remove Melissa and Richard as trustees and managers of your inheritance. We'll present evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and tonight's kidnapping. By the end of the week, you should have full control of everything your father left you. And Charlotte, there's something else. He pulled out another document, this one crisp and new. I've updated my will. will. When I die, and let's be honest, that won't be too far in the future at my age, everything I own goes to you. Not split among my children, not divided up by some complicated formula, everything to you. Because you're David's daughter, and David was the son I should have protected better. Melissa and Richard get nothing. I've made that very, very clear in the will, along with my reasons why. Let them try to contest it. Let them try to explain to a judge why they deserve anything after what they've done. I started crying then. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs for the parents I'd lost, for the childhood I'd been robbed of, for the years of being made to feel worthless when I'd actually been wealthy the entire time. Grandfather held me the way I imagined my father might have if he'd lived to see me grow up. They took everything from you, he said softly, but we're taking it back. All of it. And Charlotte, when this is over, when they're behind bars and you have control of your inheritance, I want you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll live. Really live. Not just survive, travel, start a business, fall in love, make mistakes, take risks. Your father would have wanted that for you. Your mother would have wanted that. Don't let Melissa and Richard steal one more day of your life by making you bitter or broken. Take back your power and use it to become the woman you were always meant to be. I promised him, there in that penthouse overlooking a city that suddenly felt full of possibilities instead of just tall buildings I'd never enter. I promised my grandfather, and I promised myself, and I promised the memory of parents I barely remembered, but whose love had protected me even after death through the trust they'd set up and the holdings they'd secured. The next morning would bring lawyers and court hearings and battles with my aunt and uncle that would make tonight's confrontation look gentle. But right now, in this moment, I was safe. I was believed, and I was about to become the richest woman most people in that police station had ever met. Melissa and Richard had made their biggest mistake when they locked me in that basement. They'd thought I was powerless, useless, easily discarded. They'd thought wrong, and they were about to discover just how expensive that mistake would be. I woke up in the guest bedroom of grandfather's penthouse to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the smell of fresh coffee. For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot everything that had happened. Then memory crashed back like a wave, and I sat up so fast my head spun. The clock on the nightstand read 9:42. I'd slept for less than 6 hours, but my body felt strangely alert, adrenaline still coursing through my system from the previous night's revelations. Someone had left clothes on the chair by the door, simple but expensive-looking items that were somehow exactly my size. I'd learn later that grandfather had called a personal shopper at 7 in the morning. In the kitchen, grandfather sat at a marble island with his laptop open, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when I entered and smiled, the expression transforming his tired face into something warmer. "Good morning," he said. "There's coffee in the pot, and I took the liberty of ordering breakfast from the restaurant downstairs. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I got a variety. We have about an hour before the lawyers arrive." I poured coffee into a mug that probably cost more than my entire kitchen setup at the apartment I shared with 2 roommates. "What happens when they get here?" "We go to war," grandfather said simply. "Legal war, but war nonetheless. My attorneys have been working since 5 this morning preparing emergency motions. We're filing for immediate removal of Melissa and Richard as trustees. We're demanding a full accounting of every transaction they've made in your name over the past 21 years, and we're seeking criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and kidnapping. By noon, they'll know exactly how serious we are." I sat down across from him, cradling the warm mug. "Grandfather, last night you mentioned your investigator found things about the accident. Can I see everything? I need to know what really happened to my parents." His expression turned grave. "Charlotte, are you sure? Once you see this information, you can't unsee it. The details are disturbing. They locked me in a basement because I asked questions. They stole my inheritance and made me believe I was worthless for my entire adult life. And you think they might have murdered my parents?" "Yes, I'm sure. I need to see everything." He nodded slowly and pulled a thick folder from a stack beside his laptop. "The investigator's name is Robert Morrison. Former detective, worked homicide for 23 years before retiring and starting his own firm. I hired him 6 months ago with instructions to investigate the accident without telling anyone what he was doing. What he found raises more questions than it answers, but those questions are damning." I opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a police report from October 18, 2003, my parents' accident. I'd never seen the actual report before, had only heard sanitized versions from Aunt Melissa over the years. According to the official record, my father had been driving on Route 47 at approximately 8:30 in the morning. The road was dry, weather clear, traffic light. Witnesses reported seeing the car suddenly accelerate and then veer off the road, crashing through a guardrail and down a 15-foot embankment. Both my parents had died on impact. The investigating officer had ruled it a mechanical failure after a cursory inspection of the wreckage showed compromised brake lines. "Keep reading," grandfather said quietly. The next document was from Morrison's investigation. He'd tracked down the original investigating officer, now retired, and interviewed him. The officer admitted that the inspection had been rushed, that he'd been pressured by his superiors to close the case quickly and not waste resources on what seemed like a straightforward accident. He'd assumed the brake lines had corroded naturally, never considered foul play because why would he? Young family, no obvious enemies, no reason to suspect murder. But Morrison had found the mechanic's records 3 days before the accident. My father had taken his car in for routine maintenance to a shop owned by his childhood friend. Everything had been documented as perfect, including the brake system. The mechanic, a man named Thomas Brennan, had noted specifically that the brake lines were in excellent condition and had recently been replaced. 3 days later, those same brake lines had failed catastrophically. Morrison had tried to interview Brennan, but the mechanic had refused to speak without a lawyer lawyer present. However, Morrison had obtained Brennan's phone records through a private source. In the week before my parents' accident, Brennan had received 17 calls from Uncle Richard's cell phone. After the accident, Richard had transferred $10,000 to an account in Brennan's name. That's not proof, I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. It's suspicious, but it's not proof that Richard paid Brennan to sabotage the car. Keep reading, Grandfather repeated. The next document made my blood run cold. It was a text message exchange, recovered from Brennan's old phone records through some investigative method Morrison had access to. The messages were from the day before the accident. Richard, are we still on for tomorrow morning? Brennan, I don't know, man. This feels wrong. That's a father with a kid. Richard, $10,000, plus the other matter goes away. Think about that. Brennan, what if they survive? Richard, they won't. You said yourself. Brake failure at that speed on that curve. Make sure it's at that spot. Make sure it's fast. I had to put the paper down. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold it steady. Uncle Richard had planned my parents' murder, had discussed it via text message, had worried about them surviving. The other matter, Grandfather said, his voice tight with controlled rage, refers to a DUI arrest Brennan received 3 months before the accident. Richard was on the board of the traffic court at the time. The charges were mysteriously dropped 2 weeks after my son and daughter-in-law died. Morrison found the connection buried in court records. This is evidence, I said. This proves murder. Why haven't the police arrested them? Because Morrison obtained those text messages through methods that wouldn't be admissible in court. He has a source inside the phone company who pulled archived data, which is technically illegal without a warrant. However, now that Detective Rivera and Detective Chen are officially reopening the case, they can subpoena those same records legally. It'll take time, but they'll get there. I looked through the rest of the folder. Photos of Brennan meeting with Richard at various locations over the years, apparently maintained some kind of relationship. Bank records showing Richard had continued to make payments to Brennan annually, $5,000 every October, always labeled as consulting fees. Financial documents proving that Melissa and Richard had been in desperate debt before my parents died, owing over $200,000 in credit card bills and business loans. 3 weeks after the accident, all those debts had been paid off. They used my parents' life insurance money, I realized, and the funds from my trust that they were supposed to be managing for my benefit. They murdered my parents and then stole my inheritance to pay off their gambling debts and credit cards. Yes, Grandfather said, and they've been bleeding your trust dry ever since, taking distributions that should have gone to you and spending them on Victoria's private school education, Marcus's luxury cars, exotic vacations, and maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford otherwise. When you started asking questions yesterday, they panicked. That's why they locked you in the basement. They were buying time to figure out how to silence you permanently. The doorbell rang, cutting off my response. Grandfather stood stiffly, his age showing in the careful way he moved. That'll be the lawyers. Ready to take back what's yours? I wasn't sure I was ready for anything, my mind still reeling from the evidence of my parents' murder. But I stood anyway, straightened my borrowed clothes, and followed Grandfather to the door. The legal team was formidable. 3 attorneys led by a woman named Patricia Goldstein, who looked like she'd stepped out of a courtroom drama in her perfect suit and severe hairstyle. She shook my hand with a grip that conveyed both sympathy and strength. Miss Hayes, she said, I've been Mr. William Hayes' attorney for 37 years. I watched your father build his business, and I was there when he set up your trust. What Melissa and Richard have done is not just theft. It's a betrayal of the worst kind. I promise you, we're going to destroy them legally. We sat around Grandfather's dining table, papers spread across the polished surface as Patricia and her team explained the strategy. They would file emergency motions in family court to remove Melissa and Richard as trustees immediately, arguing that the kidnapping proved they were dangerous and unfit. Simultaneously, they would file civil charges for fraud and embezzlement, seeking full restitution of every cent stolen over 2 decades. The criminal charges for kidnapping are already moving forward, Patricia explained. The police have video evidence from Mr. Hayes' security system, and your testimony places all 3 of them, Melissa, Richard, and Marcus, at the scene. That's conspiracy to commit kidnapping at minimum. But Charlotte, I need to warn you about something. What? Your aunt and uncle will fight dirty. They'll claim you're mentally unstable, that you've always been troubled, that the kidnapping story is fabricated. They'll try to paint your grandfather as senile and easily manipulated. They'll drag your reputation through the mud in any way they can to create reasonable doubt. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the basement, about the years of casual cruelty, about my parents driving to their deaths in a car with sabotaged brakes. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. Do whatever it takes. Good. There's one more thing. The inheritance you're about to claim comes with responsibilities. You'll be inheriting properties that need management, investments that require attention, business interests that demand involvement. Your father's 49% share of Hayes Enterprises makes you a major shareholder. Are you ready to step into that role? Honestly, I had no idea. Yesterday, I'd been a bookstore clerk worried about making rent. Today, I was apparently about to become a major player in a business empire. But I looked at Grandfather, at the hope and determination in his elderly face, and I knew what I had to say. My father built this company. He left it to me because he trusted I could handle it. I'm not going to let Melissa and Richard destroy what he created. So yes, I'm ready. Patricia smiled, the expression transforming her severe face. Excellent. Then let's get started. The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of signing documents, reviewing strategies, and preparing testimony. Patricia's team had been thorough, building a case that connected financial transactions, property transfers, and trust distributions into a clear pattern of theft. They had expert witnesses lined up to testify about forged signatures on documents, financial analysts ready to explain how the trust should have grown versus how it actually performed under Melissa and Richard's management. Around 1 in the afternoon, Patricia's phone rang. She listened for a moment, her expression sharpening. Understood. We're on our way. She hung up and looked at me. Melissa and Richard just showed up at the courthouse with their lawyer, trying to file a motion declaring you mentally incompetent and seeking emergency guardianship over your person and assets. They're claiming the stress of recent events has caused a psychological break and that you're being manipulated by your grandfather. The audacity was breathtaking. After kidnapping me, after stealing from me for decades, they were trying to have me declared incompetent so they could maintain control. Can they do that? I asked. They can try, Patricia said grimly, but they won't succeed. We have your statement to the police. We have video evidence of them locking you in a basement, and we have a mountain of financial documents proving systematic theft. No judge is going to grant them guardianship, but we need to get to that courthouse right now and file our counter motions before they can spin this any further. We gathered our materials and headed for the parking garage where a town car waited. On the drive to the courthouse, grandfather held my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone his age. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly, standing up to them like this, fighting back instead of running. He had that same steel in him, that refusal to be pushed around. I should have protected you better after he died, should have seen what Melissa and Richard were doing sooner. But Charlotte, I promise you this ends now. Today, they'll never hurt you again. The courthouse was chaos. News vans lined the street. Apparently someone had tipped off the media about a dramatic family court battle over millions. Reporters shouted questions as we hurried up the steps, Patricia's team forming a protective barrier around grandfather and me. Inside, I saw them. Aunt Melissa looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance disheveled. Uncle Richard's face was red with barely contained rage. Victoria stood beside them looking defiant, while Marcus hung back looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Their lawyer, a sleek man in an expensive suit, was speaking urgently with a court clerk. Aunt Melissa saw me and her expression crumpled into something that might have been genuine distress. She started toward me, but Patricia stepped between us. Don't, Patricia said coldly. Any communication goes through me. Charlotte, please, Aunt Melissa said, her voice breaking. You have to understand. We were trying to protect you. Your grandfather has filled your head with lies, turned you against your own family. We love you. We've always loved you. You locked me in a basement, I said, surprised by how steady my voice was. You stole my inheritance, and you murdered my parents. The hallway went silent. Uncle Richard's face went from red to white. Victoria gasped. Even their lawyer looked shocked. That's a lie, Uncle Richard said, but his voice shook. A vicious, insane lie. We had nothing to do with your parents' accident. The police investigated. They ruled it mechanical failure. The police are reinvestigating, I said. They have text messages between you and Thomas Brennan. They know about the payments you made him. They know everything. Uncle Richard lunged toward me, and only Marcus's quick reaction stopped him. Several security officers moved closer, hands on their radios. You can't prove anything, Richard snarled. Those messages are old. They don't mean what you think they mean. You're a stupid little girl who's been manipulated by a senile old man. That senile old man, Patricia interrupted, is William Hayes, founder and CEO of Hayes Enterprises, one of the most respected businessmen in this city. And that stupid little girl is Charlotte Hayes, majority shareholder and rightful heir to a fortune you've been stealing for 21 years. Choose your next words very carefully, Mr. Hayes, because everything you say is being recorded and will be used against you in multiple court proceedings. A bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. Hayes' guardianship case, we're ready for you. What followed was 3 hours of legal warfare that would have been fascinating if it hadn't been about my own life. Patricia presented our evidence methodically. The kidnapping caught on camera, the financial documents showing systematic theft, my testimony about years of neglect and mistreatment. She brought in a psychiatrist who had evaluated me that morning and declared me completely competent and of sound mind. Melissa and Richard's lawyer tried to argue that I was being manipulated, that grandfather was vindictive and turning me against my family, that the financial irregularities were simple misunderstandings. But every argument crumbled under the weight of evidence Patricia had assembled. The judge, a stern woman named Catherine Rodriguez, listened to both sides with increasing disapproval. When Melissa and Richard's lawyer finished his presentation, she removed her glasses and fixed them with a look that could have frozen fire. Let me see if I understand correctly, Judge Rodriguez said. You're asking this court to grant you guardianship over a 28-year-old woman who has been self-supporting, maintained steady employment, and shown no signs of mental incompetence. You're making this request one day after being arrested for kidnapping this same woman, and your justification is that she's being manipulated because she's discovered evidence that you've been stealing from her trust fund for over 2 decades. Is that accurate? Their lawyer opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Your Honor, there are family dynamics at play that I've heard enough, the judge interrupted. Not only is the petition for guardianship denied, but I'm issuing an immediate restraining order. Melissa Hayes, Richard Hayes, and all members of their household are prohibited from contacting Charlotte Hayes directly or indirectly. Furthermore, I'm ordering an emergency removal of Melissa and Richard Hayes from any and all trustee positions related to Charlotte Hayes' inheritance, effective immediately. The court will appoint a temporary neutral trustee while the fraud allegations are investigated. Melissa started crying, loud, theatrical sobs. Richard looked like he might have a stroke. Victoria was already on her phone, probably calling more expensive lawyers. Judge Rodriguez wasn't finished. I'm also ordering a full forensic audit of all trust accounts and properties associated with Charlotte Hayes. Every transaction, every distribution, every property transfer transfer will be examined. If evidence of fraud is found, I will not hesitate to refer this matter for criminal prosecution beyond the kidnapping charges already filed. This case is adjourned. She brought down her gavel, and just like that, I was free. Free from their control, free from their manipulation, free from the basement they'd tried to lock me in both literally and figuratively. In the hallway afterward, Patricia pulled me aside while grandfather spoke with the temporary trustee the court had appointed. That went better than I expected, she said. Usually these cases drag on for months, but Judge Rodriguez saw through their nonsense immediately. Charlotte, you need to prepare yourself for what comes next. The criminal investigation into your parents' deaths is going to be intense. You'll be interviewed multiple times, you'll have to relive painful memories, and you'll have to face the possibility that your aunt and uncle will never be convicted even if they did what we think they did. I understand, I said, but I have to try. My parents deserve justice. They do. And speaking of justice, there's something else you should know. I've been going through the trust documents more carefully, and Charlotte, your father was incredibly smart about how he structured your inheritance. Even with everything Melissa and Richard stole, you're still worth more than $18 million. But there's a provision in the trust that I think your father added specifically to protect you from exactly this kind of situation. What provision? Patricia smiled, and it was not a kind expression. If anyone appointed as trustee is found to have misappropriated trust funds, they're required to repay triple the amount stolen as punitive damages. Triple. And based on my preliminary calculations, Melissa and Richard have stolen approximately $4 million from you over the years, which means they owe you $12 million. They don't have $12 million, I said. No, they don't. Which means they'll have to liquidate everything they own. The house, the cars, the vacation property, Victoria's trust fund, Marcus's investment accounts, everything. They'll be bankrupted completely while you get back 3 times what they stole. Your father built in the ultimate revenge. I thought about that. Thought about Melissa and Richard losing everything while I gained it all. Thought about them facing not just criminal charges, but complete financial ruin. Part of me felt guilty for the satisfaction that realization brought, but mostly I felt like justice might actually be possible. When can we start the recovery process? I asked. We already have. The forensic accountants are being briefed as we speak. By the end of the week, we'll have a complete picture of what they stole and what you're owed. And Charlotte, there's one more thing. The restraining order the judge issued, that includes the family estate. They can't go home. You, as the legal owner of the property, according to the trust documents, now have exclusive possession. They're homeless as of this moment, at least until they find somewhere else to live. The irony was almost too perfect. They'd locked me in the basement of a house I actually owned, and now they couldn't set foot in that house without violating a court order. Grandfather found me standing in the courthouse hallway, probably with a dazed expression on my face. Ready to go home? He asked. Where's home? I asked. The penthouse or the estate? Wherever you want it to be, he said. But Charlotte, that estate has been in our family for 3 generations. It's where your father grew up, where you grew up. Don't let Melissa and Richard's poison ruin it for you. Take it back. Make it yours. Fill it with better memories. He was right. I wasn't going to let them have that too. They'd taken my parents, my childhood, my inheritance, but they weren't taking my family home. The estate, I said. I'm going home. The Hayes family estate looked different in daylight with the knowledge that it belonged to me. The sprawling colonial mansion sat on 3 acres of manicured lawn, white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. Gardens that had always seemed too perfect to touch now revealed as mine to reshape however I wanted. Patricia had arranged for a locksmith to meet us there, changing every lock while we watched to ensure Melissa and Richard couldn't return. I stood in the foyer where Marcus had grabbed my arm just 24 hours earlier, dragging me toward that basement door. The marble floors gleamed, the chandelier sparkled, and the staircase curved upward toward bedrooms that had never truly felt like mine until now. Where do you want to start? Grandfather asked. He'd insisted on coming with me for this first return, along with Patricia and 2 security guards she'd hired as a precaution. Victoria's room, I said. The words surprised me, but once I said them, I knew they were right. I want to see how she lived while I was working 2 jobs and eating ramen. Victoria's bedroom suite occupied the entire east wing of the 2nd floor. I'd been inside it maybe 3 times in my life, always hovering nervously at the door like I might contaminate something. Now I walked in with my borrowed shoes, leaving marks on the pristine white carpet. The space was obscene in its luxury. A king-sized bed with a designer canopy. A walk-in closet the size of my entire shared apartment. An ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub and separate shower. Every surface held expensive things. Designer handbags lined up like soldiers, makeup palettes that cost hundreds of dollars each, jewelry scattered carelessly on the vanity. I opened her closet. Rows of designer dresses, many with tags still attached, shoes organized by color and heel height, a fur coat that probably cost more than I'd earned in a year at the bookstore. All of this, I said quietly, running my hand along the silk dresses, was paid for with money stolen from my trust. Money my father left for my education, my future, my security. She was wearing my inheritance while I was taking out student loans. Patricia was taking photos, documenting everything for the financial investigation. Every item of significant value will be cataloged and assessed. If it was purchased with your trust funds, it becomes part of the recovery process. I moved to Victoria's desk, where her laptop sat closed. Beside it was a stack of papers that caught my attention. I picked up the top sheet and felt rage flood through me so intensely I had to grip the desk to stay steady. It was an application for a luxury car lease. A Mercedes, fully loaded, $80,000 price tag. The payment plan showed monthly installments of $2,000, and the funding source was listed as Hayes Family Trust, Charlotte Hayes beneficiary. beneficiary account. She'd been planning to buy a new car using my money, even after everything. Even with the investigation starting, she'd thought she could just keep stealing. "Look at this," I said, handing the papers to Patricia. Her jaw tightened as she read. "I'll add it to the evidence file. Charlotte, I think you should prepare yourself for what we're going to find as we go through this house. Every room is going to have something that was bought with your money." She was right. We moved through the house methodically, and every space revealed new betrayals. Marcus's room held a gaming setup worth at least $15,000. The receipts helpfully stored in a drawer showing payment from trust distributions. Aunt Melissa's closet was a museum of designer labels, her jewelry box containing pieces worth tens of thousands. Uncle Richard's home office revealed something even worse. In his desk drawer, hidden under files about his own legitimate business, I found a folder labeled Charlotte Private. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Medical records from when I was a teenager showing I'd been prescribed anti-anxiety medication, prescriptions I had no memory of taking, report cards from high school that had been altered, my actual A's changed to C's and D's, letters supposedly written by me to various family members, expressing gratitude for their support and acknowledging my emotional instability. "They were building a case," Patricia said, studying the forged documents with growing anger. "Creating a paper trail to prove you were mentally incompetent if they ever needed to defend themselves against accusations of theft. This is criminal fraud on multiple levels." I sat down in Uncle Richard's expensive leather chair, surrounded by evidence of years of calculated cruelty. "They planned this from the beginning. From the moment my parents died, they started building a narrative that would let them control everything." Grandfather had been quiet during most of the house tour, his face growing more strained with each new discovery. Now he moved to the window, looking out over the gardens where I'd played as a child, and his shoulders shook. "David trusted them," he said, his voice breaking. "My son trusted his sister and brother-in-law to take care of his daughter if anything happened to him. And they murdered him for money, then spent 21 years stealing from you while making you think you were worthless. I should have seen it. I should have stopped it." I went to him, put my hand on his shoulder. "You did see it. That's why we're here now. You collected evidence. You installed cameras. You called the police when they locked me in the basement. You saved me, grandfather. Don't blame yourself for what they did." He turned and pulled me into a hug, this elderly man who was the only family I had left who actually cared about me. "Your father loved you so much," he whispered. "Every business decision he made, every property he bought, every investment he chose, it was all with your future in mind. He wanted you to be secure, to have options, to build whatever life you dreamed of. And they took that dream and used it to fund Victoria's shopping sprees and Marcus's toys." We were interrupted by one of the security guards. "Miss Hayes, there are people at the gate. They say they're from Channel 7 News requesting an interview." Patricia swore under her breath. I should have anticipated this. The court hearing was public record, and apparently someone leaked details to the press. "Charlotte, you don't have to talk to them. We can issue a statement through my office." But I was tired of hiding, tired of being invisible, tired of letting other people control the narrative of my life. "No," I said. "I'll talk to them. Let them in." "Are you sure?" Patricia asked. "Once you go public with this story, there's no taking it back. Your privacy will be gone. Every detail will be scrutinized. They already took my privacy when they locked me in a basement and tried to have me declared incompetent. I want people to know what they did. I want everyone to see who Melissa and Richard Hayes really are." The reporter was a woman in her 30s named Jennifer Torres, professional and sharp-eyed. She set up quickly in the library, the same room where family Christmas photos had been taken, where Melissa had hosted book club meetings, where normal family life had been performed for public consumption, while I'd been systematically abused in private. Jennifer's first question was direct. "Miss Hayes, can you tell us in your own words what happened?" I told her everything. The basement, the trust fund I'd never known about, the years of being made to feel worthless while my inheritance funded my cousin's luxury lifestyles. I told her about finding the files, about grandfather's phone call, about discovering that my parents' accident might not have been an accident at all. Jennifer's eyes widened at that last revelation. "Are you saying your parents were murdered?" "I'm saying the police are reinvestigating their deaths based on new evidence. Evidence suggesting the brake failure that killed them wasn't mechanical failure, but sabotage. Evidence connecting my uncle to the mechanic who serviced their car days before the crash. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. Murder, fraud, kidnapping, embezzlement. My aunt and uncle committed all of them, and I'm going to make sure they pay for every single one." The interview lasted 45 minutes. Jennifer asked tough questions about my mental state, about whether I'd always suspected something was wrong, about what I planned to do with the inheritance once I had full control. I answered as honestly as I could, showing the forged documents we found, the receipts for luxury items bought with my money, the trust paperwork that proved everything I was saying. When it was over, Jennifer looked shaken. "This is going to be a major story, Miss Hayes. Thank you for trusting me with it." After she left, Patricia pulled me aside. "That was brave, but dangerous. Melissa and Richard's lawyers will use that interview to claim you're conducting a media trial, trying to prejudice potential jurors. You might have made things harder for the criminal case." "I don't care," I said. "Let them try to spin this. Let them explain to the public why they locked me in a basement, why they stole millions, why there are text messages between my uncle and a mechanic talking about making sure my parents didn't survive. The truth is on my side." My phone, which I'd finally retrieved from my old bedroom upstairs, started buzzing with notifications. People I hadn't heard from in years were reaching out, expressing shock and support. My boss at the bookstore texted asking if I was okay and if I'd be coming back to work. The idea of returning to that job, of shelving books for $12 an hour when I was worth $18 million seemed surreal. But that's exactly what grandfather had warned me about the night before. Don't let the money change who you are. Don't let it make you bitter or reckless or someone you don't recognize. I called my boss back instead of texting. Hi Sarah, it's Charlotte. I'm okay, but I don't think I'll be returning to the store. I'm dealing with some family things, and it's going to take all my time and energy for a while. I saw the news, Sarah said quietly. Charlotte, I had no idea you were going through all that. If you need anything at all, please call me. It was the same response I was getting from everyone who actually knew me. Friends, co-workers, even casual acquaintances were rallying with support. Meanwhile, my actual family was trying to destroy me in court. That evening, we all sat in the estate's formal dining room, the same table where I'd been excluded from so many family meals, and ordered pizza. The absurdity of eating delivery pizza on China worth thousands of dollars wasn't lost on any of us. The forensic audit is complete, Patricia said, pulling out a tablet. It took my team all day, but they've traced every transaction connected to your trust for the past 21 years. Charlotte, the total stolen is actually higher than I estimated. $4.7 million. $4.7 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. Which means, Patricia continued, under the triple damages provision, they owe you just over $14 million. The good news is that their assets, when liquidated, will cover about $9 million of that. The rest will recover through wage garnishments and future earnings, essentially ensuring they'll never be financially stable again. What about Victoria and Marcus? I asked. They benefited from the theft, even if they weren't directly managing it. Complicated. Marcus is an adult who definitely knew what was happening and participated in your kidnapping. He'll face criminal charges and could be held liable for restitution. Victoria is trickier because she was a minor for part of the theft period, but anything purchased for her with stolen funds in the last few years, once she turned 18, can be recovered. The doorbell rang. We all froze. The security guard went to check, returning a moment later looking uncomfortable. It's Victoria, he said. She's alone, and she says she needs to talk to you. She's not trying to come in, just standing at the door. She looks like she's been crying. Patricia shook her head firmly. The restraining order prohibits contact. If she violates it, we can have her arrested. But I was curious what my cousin could possibly have to say that would make her risk arrest. Let her stand at the door. I'll talk to her from the threshold. You all can witness that I'm not allowing her inside and that this is her initiation of contact, not mine. We moved to the front door. Through the glass, I could see Victoria standing on the porch. She looked different without her usual perfect makeup and designer armor. Her face was blotchy from crying, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Wearing jeans and a sweater I recognized as one of mine that she'd borrowed years ago and never returned. I opened the door but didn't step outside. You have 5 minutes before I call the police for restraining order violation. Charlotte, she began, and her voice was raw. I know you hate me. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know that I didn't know. About the murder, I mean. About your parents. I swear on my life, I didn't know what Dad did. But you knew about the theft, I said flatly. You knew where your car came from, your clothes, your lifestyle. You knew I was working retail while you were spending my money. She flinched. I knew Mom and Dad were managing your trust. They told me you were getting everything you needed, that the rest was being invested for your future. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know if they were lying. And I'm so sorry for that, Charlotte. I'm so sorry I was a coward. And why are you here, Victoria? What do you possibly think you can say that matters now? I'm here because I found something. In Mom's safe. The one Dad doesn't know about. And I think you need to see it before the police get to it. She held up a manila envelope. It's letters between Mom and someone named Thomas Brennan. Letters talking about the accident, about keeping secrets, about making sure you never found out the truth, Charlotte. I think my mom was more involved in your parents' deaths than we knew, and I think she's planning to run. I looked at Patricia, who nodded slowly. Have Victoria give the envelope to the security guard. Don't touch it yourself in case there are fingerprints we need to preserve. And Victoria, you realize what you're doing could help convict your mother? My mother locked my cousin in a basement and tried to have her declared insane, Victoria said, and tears were running down her face now. My mother helped kill Charlotte's parents for money. She's a monster, and I've spent my whole life pretending she wasn't because it was easier than facing the truth. I'm done being a coward. The security guard took the envelope with gloved hands. Patricia photographed Victoria handing it over, documenting the chain of custody. Victoria looked at me one more time. I know nothing I do can make up for what my family did to you. But Charlotte, for what it's worth, you were always better than all of us. Stronger, kinder, more real. We treated you like garbage because we knew we'd never measure up to you. And now you're going to take everything from us, and we deserve it. She turned and walked back to a beat-up Honda parked at the curb, nothing like her usual luxury vehicle. I watched her drive away. This cousin who had tormented me for years, now apparently having some kind of moral awakening at the worst possible time for her family. Inside, Patricia carefully opened the envelope. The letters inside were damning in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Aunt Melissa had been in direct contact with Brennan for years, sending him annual payments to maintain his discretion. But the earliest letter was dated 2 weeks before my parents' accident, and it made everything clear. Thomas, Aunt Melissa had written in her precise handwriting, Richard assures me you understand the necessity of what we're asking. David has left us no choice with his accusations and threats. The plan Richard outlined must happen exactly as discussed. I need you to understand that this is not just about protecting ourselves. If David exposes us, his own daughter will suffer. She'll grow up knowing her father destroyed her family over money. We're actually protecting her by removing him from the equation. She's young enough that she won't remember him clearly. She'll have us instead, and we'll make sure she's taken care of. This is for for the greater good. The greater good. They'd convinced themselves that murdering my parents was actually a kindness to me. The rest of the letters were Melissa checking in with Brennan over the years, making sure he was staying quiet, reminding him of the consequences if he ever talked. The most recent letter was dated just 3 weeks ago, after grandfather had confronted them about the missing trust funds. If things fall apart, Melissa had written, if somehow Charlotte finds out and authorities get involved, you need to disappear. I've set up an account in the Cayman Islands with enough money for you to start over somewhere far away. Richard can't know about this. He'd never approve of me protecting you this way, but I can't risk you talking, and I certainly can't risk you implicating me more deeply than him. If it comes to it, everything falls on Richard. He approached you, he made the plan, he paid you. I was just a wife who suspected something but didn't have proof until it was too late. That's our story if we need it. She'd been planning to throw Uncle Richard under the bus, planning to let him take the full blame for murder while she played the innocent victim who'd been deceived by her husband. We need to get these to Detective Rivera immediately, Patricia said. This is direct evidence of premeditated murder and conspiracy. Charlotte, I think Victoria might have just handed us everything we need to ensure both your aunt and uncle spend the rest of their lives in prison. Grandfather was reading over Patricia's shoulder, his hands shaking. My daughter, he whispered. I raised her. I taught her right from wrong. How did she become capable of this? I didn't have an answer for him. How does anyone become capable of murder? How does a mother decide that money is worth more than her brother's life? How does a couple look at a 7-year-old orphan and decide she's just a resource to exploit? My phone rang. Detective Rivera. Patricia put him on speaker. Miss Hayes, he said, we've just received information that Melissa Hayes purchased a one-way ticket to Brazil. Flight leaves at 6 tomorrow morning. We're moving to arrest her tonight before she can flee. Detective, Patricia interrupted, we have new evidence you need to see immediately. Letters between Melissa Hayes and Thomas Brennan that prove premeditated murder. We can bring them to the station right now. On my way to pick them up personally, Detective Rivera said. Don't let anyone else touch those letters. He arrived 20 minutes later with Detective Chen and 2 uniformed officers. We handed over the envelope, and I watched these seasoned detectives read through the letters with expressions of growing disgust. This is it, Detective Chen said. This is exactly what we needed. Miss Hayes, I'm going to be honest with you. Without these letters, we had suspicious circumstances, but not enough for murder charges. Richard's text messages were damning, but he could have claimed they were taken out of context, that he was joking or talking about something else. But this? Melissa literally wrote out their plan to murder your parents and has been documenting her cover-up efforts for 2 decades. There's no ambiguity here. Will you be able to arrest them tonight? I asked. We're mobilizing teams now, Detective Rivera said. Melissa Hayes is being picked up as we speak. Richard Hayes is more complicated because he's currently with his attorney, but we'll have him by morning. And Miss Hayes, I want to warn you about something. This is going to be a media circus. The murder of 2 people, the theft of millions, a kidnapping, all involving a wealthy family. Every news outlet is going to be covering this story. You should prepare yourself for intense scrutiny. Let them scrutinize, I said. Let everyone see exactly who Melissa and Richard Hayes are. Let everyone know what they did to my parents and to me. I'm not hiding anymore. After the detectives left, the 3 of us sat in the living room in a strange state of shell-shocked relief. It was nearly midnight. In 24 hours, I'd gone from being a powerless bookstore clerk locked in a basement to a multi-millionaire bringing down her murderous relatives. What happens now? I asked. Now, Patricia said, we wait for the arrests, cooperate with the prosecution, and start the process of rebuilding your life. The forensic audit is complete, the criminal charges are filed, and the civil case is airtight. Within a few months, you'll have full control of your inheritance. Melissa and Richard will be in prison, and you can decide what kind of future you want to build. I want to start a foundation, I said. The words surprised me, but once I said them, I knew they were right. In my parents' names, for children who've lost parents, especially kids being raised by relatives who might not have their best interests at heart. Legal aid, financial auditing, advocacy. I want to make sure no other kid goes through what I went through. Grandfather smiled through tears. Your father would love that. He always said the purpose of wealth wasn't keeping it, but using it to fix things that were broken. We stayed up talking until nearly 3 in the morning, making plans, discussing options, imagining futures that didn't involve that and betrayal and basement prisons. When I finally went to bed in the master suite that had once belonged to my parents, I slept dreamlessly for the first time in years. I woke to my phone ringing at 7. Patricia's name on the screen. Turn on the news, she said without preamble. Channel 7. I found the remote and switched on the television. Jennifer Torres was standing outside the police station doing a live report. Breaking news this morning as police have arrested Melissa and Richard Hayes in connection with the 1983 murder of David and Sarah Hayes. Sources close to the investigation say new evidence, including letters written by Melissa Hayes, prove the couple orchestrated the deaths to gain control of the Hayes family fortune and the trust fund of the victim's daughter, Charlotte Hayes. Both suspects are being held without bail, and police say additional charges are expected. This case, which began just 3 days ago with a shocking kidnapping, has now exploded into one of the most dramatic family crime cases this city has seen in decades. The screen cut to video of Melissa being led into the police station in handcuffs, her hair disheveled, her face puffy from crying. She looked nothing like the polished, controlled woman who had ruled the Hayes family with cold calculation. She looked like what she was, a murderer finally caught after 2 decades. Richard was shown being arrested at his lawyer's office, trying to maintain his dignity even as officers read him his rights. His face was red with impotent rage, knowing that all his careful plans had crumbled in just 3 days. My phone started buzzing with messages. Friends, distant relatives, even people I'd barely spoken to in years, all reaching out with shock and support. The story was everywhere, trending on social media, being discussed on morning shows. I got dressed and went downstairs to find grandfather already up, watching a different news channel showing the same story. He turned when I entered, and for the first time since I'd seen him at the penthouse, he looked at peace. They're caught, he said simply. David and Sarah can rest now. Justice is finally coming. It's not over yet, I reminded him. They'll fight the charges. It could be years before there's a conviction. Let them bite, he said. They'll lose. The evidence is overwhelming, and now that their crimes are public, they can't intimidate witnesses or manipulate the system. They're finished, Charlotte. You won. Your parents won. Looking at the television screen, at the image of Melissa being escorted into a police station, I realized he was right. I had won. Not just the financial battle, but the war for truth. My parents' murders would be avenged. My stolen inheritance would be returned. And Melissa and Richard Hayes would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. The basement where they'd tried to lock me away forever had instead been the place where I found the evidence that destroyed them. Sometimes justice has a sense of irony. The trial began on a cold January morning, 3 months after the arrests. The courthouse steps were packed with media, protesters holding signs demanding justice, and curious onlookers hoping for a glimpse of the accused murderers. I sat in the front row of the gallery with grandfather on one side and Patricia on the other, watching as Melissa and Richard were led into the courtroom in prison jumpsuits. They'd both aged decades in those 3 months. Melissa's perfectly maintained appearance had crumbled, her hair showing gray roots, her face lined with stress. Richard had lost weight, his expensive suits replaced with ill-fitting prison attire, his commanding presence reduced to defeated slouching. They didn't look at me as they took their seats at the defense table. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Marcus Chen, a man with a reputation for being ruthless with defendants who thought their wealth could buy immunity. His opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is a case about greed so profound that it led to murder. About a couple who looked at a successful family member and decided they deserved his money more than he deserved his life. About parents who saw a 7-year-old orphan not as a child to protect, but as a resource to exploit. Over the next few weeks, you will hear evidence that proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Melissa and Richard Hayes murdered David and Sarah Hayes in cold blood, then spent 21 years stealing from their victim's daughter while making her believe she was worthless." He walked the jury through the timeline. David discovering the embezzlement, Richard contacting Thomas Brennan, the text messages planning the brake sabotage, the $10,000 payment after my parents died. Then he showed them Melissa's letters, each one read aloud in the courtroom, her own words condemning her. When he read the line about how killing my parents was for the greater good, because I was young enough that she won't remember him clearly, I heard gasps from the gallery. Several jurors looked at Melissa with open disgust. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the letters were forgeries, that the text messages were taken out of context, that the brake failure was a tragic coincidence. But their arguments sounded hollow even to me, and I knew what they were trying to defend. Thomas Brennan testified on the third day, having taken a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in months, his hands shaking as he took the oath. "Richard Hayes contacted me in September 2003, Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He said his brother-in-law was causing problems and needed to be dealt with. At first, I thought he meant roughing him up or something, but then he explained what he really wanted, a brake failure that would look like an accident. He offered me $10,000 and said he'd make a DUI charge I was facing disappear. Did you agree?" The prosecutor asked. "Yes." Brennan's voice broke. "God help me. Yes. I needed the money, and I was facing jail time for the DUI. Richard said it would be quick, painless, that David wouldn't even know what happened. I told myself it was just business, just a job. I didn't think about the wife, about the kid they'd be leaving behind. What exactly did you do to David Hayes' vehicle?" I cut partway through the brake lines. Not enough to fail immediately, but enough that they'd rupture under heavy use. Richard told me the route David took to work, showed me a specific curve where the brakes would be most critical. I made sure the failure would happen at exactly that spot. And did Melissa Hayes know about this plan? She was the one who told me where David kept his car at night, what time he left for work in the morning. She gave me the security code to get into their garage. Richard handled the planning, but Melissa made it possible. The defense tried to discredit Brennan on cross-examination, painting him as a convicted criminal trying to reduce his sentence by lying. But they couldn't explain away the letters, the bank records showing Richard's payments, or the phone logs proving contact between all three conspirators. On the 5th day, I was called to testify. Walking to the witness stand, I could feel Melissa's eyes on me for the first time since the trial began. I took the oath and sat down, looking directly at the jury. The prosecutor took me through my entire story. The childhood of neglect, the years of being made to feel worthless, the discovery of the trust fund, the kidnapping. I testified about finding the files in the basement, about grandfather's phone call, about the moment I realized my aunt and uncle had stolen my entire life. "Miss Hayes," the prosecutor said, "in your own words, what was the impact of learning that your parents' death might not have been an accident?" I took a breath. It made everything make sense in the worst possible way. I'd always wondered why my father crashed that day. He was so careful, so responsible, but I'd accepted the official story because what else could I do? Finding out it wasn't an accident, that my aunt and uncle had murdered him and my mother for money, it was like losing them all over again. But worse, because now I knew they'd been taken from me deliberately by people who were supposed to love us. And the theft of your inheritance? How did that impact you? I spent my entire adult life believing I was nothing, that I had to be grateful for whatever scraps my family gave me because I had nothing of my own. I worked multiple jobs through college, took out loans I'm still paying off, lived in the smallest room of a house I actually owned, all while my cousins were spending my money on luxury cars and designer clothes. They didn't just steal my inheritance, they stole my sense of self-worth. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, as Patricia had warned me it would be. He tried to paint me as vengeful and opportunistic, suggested that I'd fabricated evidence with grandfather's help, implied that my testimony was motivated by greed rather than justice. Isn't it true, Miss Hayes, that you stand to inherit millions of dollars if your aunt and uncle are convicted? I stand to inherit what was always mine, I replied. What my father left me, what they stole. This isn't about greed. If it was, I would have taken a settlement and stayed quiet. This is about making sure they pay for murdering my parents. But you can't actually prove they murdered anyone, can you? You were 7 years old when your parents died. You have no personal knowledge of what happened. No, but I have letters written by my aunt detailing the plan. I have text messages between my uncle and the mechanic who sabotaged the car. I have financial records showing payments made to ensure silence. That's not personal knowledge, that's evidence. He tried several more angles, but nothing stuck. I'd spent 3 months preparing for this testimony with Patricia, anticipating every question, every attempt to discredit me. When I finally stepped down, I could see from the jury's faces that they believed me. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. Expert witnesses testified about the brake sabotage, financial analysts explained the theft of trust funds, and character witnesses painted a picture of David and Sarah Hayes as loving parents whose lives were cut short by greed. Victoria testified for the prosecution, looking small and scared on the witness stand. She described growing up watching her parents treat me like an inconvenience, overhearing conversations about managing Charlotte's money, and finally finding her mother's letters and realizing the full extent of the crimes. Did you ever suspect your parents had killed Charlotte's parents? The prosecutor asked. No, Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. I knew they were stealing from her. I knew that was wrong. But murder? I never imagined they were capable of that. When I found those letters, I couldn't breathe. My mother had helped kill my uncle and aunt, had orphaned my cousin, and then spent 21 years stealing from her and making her feel worthless. I couldn't protect that anymore. Melissa's attorney tried to portray Victoria as a traitor, a daughter who'd turned on her family for attention, but Victoria held firm. They're not my family anymore, she said. Family doesn't murder each other for money. Family doesn't lock children in basements. Charlotte is more family to me now than they ever were, because she had the courage to stand up for what's right even when it cost her everything. The defense rested their case after 2 days, having presented nothing that contradicted the mountain of evidence against them. Melissa and Richard didn't testify in their own defense, their attorneys probably recognizing that putting them on the stand would be disastrous. Closing arguments began on a Tuesday. The prosecutor methodically walked through every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every damning letter and text message. He painted a picture of cold, calculated murder followed by decades of systematic theft and abuse. Melissa and Richard Hayes are not the victims here, he concluded. They are predators who saw an opportunity to get rich and took it, regardless of who they had to kill. They are thieves who stole not just money, but a childhood, an identity, a sense of worth. They are kidnappers who locked their victim in a basement when she dared to ask questions. And they are murderers who ended 2 lives and destroyed a third. Justice demands that you find them guilty on all counts. The defense's closing argument tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial, that Brennan was an unreliable witness, that grief and anger had clouded everyone's judgment. But even they seemed to know it was futile. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict with no hesitation. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree regarding David Hayes, we find the defendant, Melissa Hayes, guilty. Melissa made a choking sound, her hand flying to her mouth. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree regarding Sarah Hayes, we find the defendant, Melissa Hayes, guilty. On the count of first-degree fraud, we find the defendant, Melissa Hayes, guilty. On the count of embezzlement, we find the defendant, Melissa Hayes, guilty. On the count of kidnapping, we find the defendant, Melissa Hayes, guilty. The verdicts continued, guilty on every single count. Then the foreman moved to Richard's charges, and it was the same. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 23 counts in total, each one sealing their fate a little more firmly. When the foreman finished, Melissa collapsed in her chair, sobbing. Richard sat frozen, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't process what was happening. Their attorneys slumped in defeat. Judge Rodriguez set sentencing for 2 weeks later. The defendants will remain in custody without bail until that time, she announced. This court is adjourned. As they were led out in handcuffs, Melissa finally looked at me. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw everything in her expression. Rage, disbelief, and something that might have been regret. But it was too late for regret. Decades too late. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. I'd prepared a brief statement with Patricia's help. Today, justice was served for my parents, David and Sarah Hayes, who were murdered 21 years ago by people they trusted. Justice was served for every child whose inheritance has been stolen by unscrupulous guardians. And justice was served for me. I want to thank the jury, the prosecutors, Detective Rivera and Detective Chen, and everyone who helped bring the truth to light. My parents deserved better than they got, and now their killers will spend the rest of their lives paying for what they did. What will you do now? A reporter shouted. I'm going to live, I said. I'm going to build the life my parents wanted for me, the life my aunt and uncle tried to steal, and I'm going to make sure that no other child suffers what I I suffered. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the trial. Judge Rodriguez was thorough and unforgiving. "Melissa and Richard Hayes," she began, "you have been convicted of some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You murdered 2 people in cold blood for financial gain. You orphaned a child and then spent 2 decades systematically abusing and stealing from her. You showed no remorse, no humanity, no recognition of the pain you caused. This court sees no reason for leniency." She sentenced them each to life in prison without possibility of parole for the murder charges, with additional decades tacked on for the fraud, embezzlement, and kidnapping. Even if some miracle occurred and the murder convictions were overturned, they'd still die behind bars. Marcus received 5 years for his role in the kidnapping, having cooperated with prosecutors and shown genuine remorse. Thomas Brennan received 15 years as part of his plea deal, a lighter sentence that still meant he'd likely die in prison given his age and health. Victoria received no charges, having provided crucial evidence, and having been a minor during much of the theft period, she'd moved out of state, taking a job and trying to rebuild a life away from the Hayes name. As Melissa and Richard were led away for the final time, I felt something release in my chest. Not joy exactly, but closure. The people who had murdered my parents and stolen my childhood were going to prison forever. The truth was known. Justice had been served. Grandfather squeezed my hand. "It's over," he said softly. "Finally, it's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. Because while the criminal case had concluded, I still had a life to rebuild, an inheritance to claim, a future to create. The civil case had proceeded in parallel with the criminal trial, and the judgment was even more devastating to what remained of Melissa and Richard's assets. The court ordered them to pay me $14.1 million in restitution and punitive damages. Since they were now in prison for life with no income, the money would come from liquidating everything they owned. The house where I'd been locked in the basement was sold to a nice family with 3 young children. I took satisfaction in knowing that those rooms would now hold laughter instead of cruelty. Marcus's luxury cars were auctioned off. Victoria's designer wardrobe was sold to a consignment shop. Every piece of furniture, every piece of jewelry, every asset they'd accumulated with my stolen money was converted to cash and returned to me. The financial recovery, combined with my existing trust fund and grandfather's new will making me his sole heir, put my net worth at approximately $27 million. I was 28 years old and wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible. But money, I was learning, couldn't erase trauma, couldn't give me back my parents or my childhood, couldn't undo the years of being made to feel worthless. I started therapy 3 times a week with Dr. Elaine Morrison, who specialized in childhood trauma and family abuse. The first few sessions, I just cried. Years of suppressed pain pouring out in her quiet office with its soft lighting and comfortable couch. "You're grieving multiple losses simultaneously," Dr. Morrison explained during our 4th session. "The parents you lost as a child, the childhood you never got to have, the family you thought you had, and even the identity you'd constructed around being the family disappointment. That's a lot to process." She was right. Some days I felt strong and vindicated. Other days I felt lost, unsure of who Charlotte Hayes was supposed to be now that she wasn't poor, powerless, or dependent on people who hated her. Grandfather helped by involving me in the family business. Hayes Enterprises needed restructuring after years of Melissa and Richard's mismanagement. I started attending board meetings, learning about the investments my father had made, understanding the empire he'd built with the intention of leaving it to me. "You have good instincts," the CFO told me after I'd questioned a proposed acquisition that would have been a disaster. "Your father had the same ability to see through flashy presentations to the real numbers underneath. You're more like him than you know." I also started the foundation I'd promised myself I'd create, the David and Sarah Hayes Foundation for Child Advocacy, focused on protecting children in guardianship situations from financial exploitation. We provided free legal services, forensic accounting, and advocacy for kids whose relatives were managing their inheritances. Within 6 months, we'd helped recover over $3 million for children whose guardians had been stealing from them. "You're saving other kids from what happened to you," grandfather said as we reviewed the foundation's first quarterly report. "Your parents would be so proud." But not everything was about work and justice. Dr. Morrison kept pushing me to build a personal life, to make connections that weren't related to the trauma I'd experienced. I reconnected with old friends from college, people I'd drifted away from because I'd been too exhausted from working multiple jobs to maintain relationships. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see but couldn't afford. I took cooking classes, learned to paint, adopted a rescue dog named Justice who followed me everywhere. Slowly, carefully, I started dating. Nothing serious at first, just learning what it felt like to be valued by someone who had no connection to my money or my family drama. I made mistakes, trusted the wrong people a few times, got my heart bruised, but Dr. Morrison said that was healthy, that I was learning to be vulnerable again. On the 1-year anniversary of the night I'd been locked in the basement, I stood in that same space with contractors. We were converting it into something better. "I want to turn this into an art studio," I told them. "Lots of natural light, comfortable space for creating. The basement that was supposed to be my prison is going to be where I make beautiful things." They installed skylights that seemed impossible but somehow worked, flooding the space with sunshine, added heating and comfortable furniture, painted the walls in warm colors. When it was finished, it looked nothing like the cold, dark space where I'd found those files. It looked like hope. I started painting down there. Nothing particularly good at first, but the act of creation felt therapeutic. Taking blank canvases and filling them with color, turning emptiness into something meaningful. A metaphor so obvious that Dr. Morrison actually actually laughed when I mentioned it. Sometimes the obvious metaphors are obvious because they're true, she said. You're quite literally transforming the space of your trauma into something creative and life-giving. That's powerful work, Charlotte. Grandfather's health declined that summer. Not suddenly, but gradually enough that we both knew what was coming. He made sure all his affairs were in order, his will updated and ironclad, his legacy secured. We spent long afternoons in the penthouse talking about my father, about the business they'd built together, about the life he wanted me to have. I'm sorry I didn't see what Melissa and Richard were doing sooner, he said one evening as we watched the sunset over the city. I'm sorry I let them hurt you for so long. You couldn't have known, I replied, holding his hand. They were good at hiding it, and when you did figure it out, you took action. You saved me, grandfather. You gave me the tools to save myself. Your father would have done better, he insisted. He would have protected you from day one. Maybe, but he's not here and you are. You've been the grandfather I needed, especially this past year. That matters more than you know. He passed away peacefully in September, surrounded by me and a few close friends. 2 weeks after the annual payment from my trust that he'd fought so hard to protect finally came through without interference. His last words to me were, "Make him proud." I promised I would. The reading of his will was straightforward. Everything to me, as he'd promised. No surprises, no drama, just the simple transfer of wealth from grandfather to granddaughter. Combined with my father's inheritance that I'd finally recovered and the restitution from Melissa and Richard, my net worth now exceeded $40 million. I was one of the youngest self-made. I had to laugh at that term. Millionaires in the country. But I'd paid for it with my parents' lives, my childhood, and years of abuse. Some inheritances cost more than others. 2 years after that night in the basement, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Hayes estate, now transformed into something my parents would have loved. The annual gala for the David and Sarah Hayes Foundation filled the space with people who believed in protecting vulnerable children, who understood that inheritance wasn't just about money, but about legacy and responsibility. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We now operated in 17 states, had recovered over $32 million for children whose guardians had been stealing from them, and had successfully prosecuted 43 cases of financial exploitation. Every child we helped was a tribute to my parents, a way of ensuring their deaths hadn't been meaningless. I wore a dress that cost more than I'd earned in an entire year at the bookstore, but I'd stopped feeling guilty about my wealth. Dr. Morrison had helped me understand that the money wasn't the problem. The money was just a tool. What mattered was how I used it. Charlotte, Victoria approached, hesitant as always at these events. We'd rebuilt something resembling a relationship over the past 2 years, though it would never be what it might have been if our family hadn't been destroyed by greed. She worked for the foundation now, using her law degree to help prosecute guardianship abuse cases. There's someone I'd like you to meet. She introduced me to a woman named Jennifer Park, who ran a similar organization in California. We talked for an hour about expanding the foundation's reach, about creating a national network, about changing laws to better protect children. The conversation energized me in a way that board meetings about Hayes Enterprises never quite did. This was my real passion, not managing properties or making investments, but using my resources to prevent other children from experiencing what I'd experienced. Later that evening, I found myself in what used to be grandfather's study, now my office, looking at the photos on the wall, my parents on their wedding day, young and full of hope, grandfather and my father at the opening of their first major property development, me as a baby, held by parents I barely remembered but whose love had protected me even after death. "They'd be proud of you," a voice said from the doorway. Detective Rivera, who'd been invited to the gala along with Detective Chen, stepped inside. "I followed your foundation's work. You're making a real difference." "I'm trying," I said. "Some days it feels like I'm fighting an endless battle. For every child we help, there are dozens more being exploited by people who are supposed to protect them. But you're helping the ones you can reach," he replied. "That's what matters. And Charlotte, I wanted to tell you something. The investigation into your parents' case changed how our department handles suspicious deaths. We've reopened 17 cold cases based on what we learned from your situation. 3 of those have resulted in murder convictions. Your parents' case exposed flaws in our system, and we're fixing them because of you." It was perhaps the best compliment I'd ever received. My parents' deaths had led to systemic change that would protect others. Their tragedy had meaning beyond just my personal justice. After the gala ended and the last guests departed, I walked through the empty house that was finally, truly mine. Every room had been renovated, the spaces where Melissa and Richard had ruled replaced with something warmer, more welcoming. I'd kept some pieces that had belonged to my parents, integrated them with new furniture that reflected my own taste rather than someone else's vision of who I should be. The basement art studio had become my favorite retreat. I'd gotten better at painting over the past 2 years, my work evolving from therapeutic exercises to pieces that galleries had actually shown interest in displaying, not because of my name or wealth, but because they were genuinely good. I went down there now, switching on the lights that illuminated the space grandfather's contractors had transformed. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, some still in progress. My latest project was a series exploring themes of inheritance, legacy, and what we carry from those who came before us. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my former boss at the bookstore who had become one of my closest friends. "How did the gala go? Did you give your speech without passing out?" I smiled and replied, "Survived without fainting. You should have been there to keep me grounded. You don't need me for that anymore. You're doing just fine on your own." She was right, though it had taken me a long time to believe it. I'd spent so many years defining myself by what I lacked, by what had been taken from me, that learning to define myself by what I built had been almost as hard as the legal battles. But I was building something worthwhile. The foundation was thriving. Hayes Enterprises was more profitable and ethical than it had been under Melissa and Richard's management. I had friendships based on genuine connection rather than obligation. I had a therapist who'd helped me process trauma without letting it consume me. I had Justice, my rescue dog, who provided unconditional love without expecting anything in return. And I had purpose. Every child we helped recover stolen inheritance, every guardian we prosecuted for exploitation, every life we changed for the better, it all mattered. It all meant something. The last time I'd visited Melissa and Richard in prison had been 6 months ago. A visit Dr. Morrison had suggested might help with closure. They were both diminished, aged beyond their years by incarceration, by guilt, or perhaps just by the weight of their crimes. Melissa had tried to apologize, a rambling explanation about how she'd convinced herself that what they were doing was somehow justified. "We gave you a home," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "We fed you, clothed you, kept you safe. Doesn't that count for something? You murdered my parents," I'd replied calmly. "You stole my inheritance. You made me believe I was worthless while you spent my money on luxury items. No, feeding me the bare minimum while stealing millions doesn't count for anything." Richard had been angrier, still insisting that they'd done nothing wrong, that the justice system had been biased against them, that I'd somehow orchestrated their downfall. He'd always been better at denial than acceptance. I'd left that prison feeling neither vindication nor satisfaction, just a profound sadness for what could have been if they'd chosen differently. If they'd been the guardians my parents had hoped they'd be. If they'd valued family over money. But dwelling on what could have been was pointless. I'd learned that in therapy, in rebuilding my life, in moving forward despite the weight of my past. The only thing I could control was what happened next. Tonight, standing in my art studio that used to be a prison, I started a new painting. This one wasn't about trauma or loss or betrayal. It was about transformation, about taking something dark and making it luminous, about finding beauty in survival. I worked until dawn, lost in the creative process, justice sleeping at my feet. When I finally stepped back to look at what I'd created, I saw something that surprised me. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope rendered in colors that seemed to glow from within the canvas. My phone rang as I was cleaning my brushes. An unfamiliar number, but something made me answer. "Miss Hayes? This is Detective Maria Santos from the Los Angeles Police Department. Detective Rivera gave me your number. We have a case here. A 13-year-old girl whose uncle has been managing her trust fund after her parents died in a car accident. She came to us because she found documents suggesting he's been stealing from her. The situation sounds very similar to what you experienced, and I was hoping your foundation might be able to help." I grabbed a notepad. "Tell me everything." As Detective Santos explained the case, detailing the red flags that had prompted the investigation, I felt that familiar fire ignite in my chest. Another child being exploited by someone who should have protected her. Another family betrayal that needed to be exposed. "We can help," I said. "I'll have our legal team contact you today. We'll need copies of all the financial documents, the trust paperwork, any evidence of misappropriation. And Detective Santos, that girl needs to know she's not alone, that what's happening to her isn't her fault, that there are people who will fight for her. I'll tell her," Detective Santos said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. You're giving this kid hope." After we hung up, I sat in my studio watching the sunrise through the skylights. Another child to help, another battle to fight, another chance to turn tragedy into something meaningful. This was what my parents had wanted for me. Not just wealth, though that was part of it, but purpose. The ability to make a difference, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that their deaths led to something more than just grief. I thought about the Charlotte Hayes who had existed 2 years ago. The bookstore clerk who believed she was worthless, who accepted cruelty as normal, who didn't know she owned the house she was locked in. That Charlotte was gone, transformed by trauma and justice and the hard work of healing. The Charlotte Hayes who existed now was stronger, wiser, more purposeful. She ran a foundation that changed lives. She managed a business empire ethically and successfully. She created art that expressed truths words couldn't capture. She had weathered the worst that family betrayal could inflict and come out not just surviving, but thriving. My phone buzzed with a message from the foundation's legal director. "Just heard about the LA case. Team is ready to deploy. This is what we do best." Yes, I thought, looking around my studio at the paintings that documented my journey from victim to victor. This is what we do best. We take darkness and make it luminous. We take betrayal and turn it into justice. We take inherited trauma and transform it into inherited strength. I'd been locked in a basement and told I was useless. I'd discovered my parents were murdered for money. I'd learned that the family I trusted had stolen my entire inheritance. And from all of that pain, all of that betrayal, I'd built something that mattered. The David and Sarah Hayes Foundation would help that 13-year-old girl in Los Angeles. We'd recover her stolen inheritance, prosecute her exploitative uncle, and show her that she was valuable and worthy and powerful, just like Detective Rivera and grandfather and Patricia and even Victoria had shown me. This was my legacy. Not the money, though that made the work possible. Not the properties or investments or business empire. My legacy was every child we helped, every guardian we stopped, every family we prevented from experiencing what mine had experienced. I picked up my phone and sent a message to the foundation's board. "Emergency meeting at 9. We have a new case in Los Angeles. 13-year-old girl, deceased parents, theft of inheritance by guardian. I want our best people on this immediately." The responses came quickly. Everyone was ready. Everyone understood that this was why we existed. To catch children before they they fell, to fight guardians who betrayed their trust, to ensure that not every orphan ended up locked in a basement discovering the truth too late. As I cleaned up my studio and prepared for the day ahead, I thought about the question that journalist had asked me outside the courthouse 2 years ago. What will you do now? I'd said I was going to live, and I had. I'd built a life that honored my parents' memory, that used my inheritance for good, that transformed personal tragedy into societal change. I'd taken the worst things that ever happened to me and refused to let them define me. Melissa and Richard were in prison for life. Marcus was serving his sentence. Victoria was rebuilding her life and trying to atone by helping other victims. Thomas Brennan would die behind bars. Justice had been served as fully as the legal system allowed, but more importantly, I was free. Free from their control, their manipulation, their cruelty. Free to be whoever Charlotte Hayes was meant to be without their poison shaping my self-worth. I'd discovered that inheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was about carrying forward the best of those who came before you, while leaving behind the worst. My parents had left me financial security, yes, but also their values, their integrity, their belief that wealth should be used to help others. Melissa and Richard had tried to steal that inheritance, but they'd failed. They'd stolen money, but they couldn't steal who I was at my core. They'd murdered my parents, but they couldn't kill the legacy David and Sarah Hayes had created. As I walked upstairs to shower and prepare for the foundation meeting, Justice padding along beside me, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The face that looked back wasn't the frightened girl who'd been locked in a basement. It wasn't the victim who'd discovered her family's betrayal. It was a woman who'd survived, who'd fought back, who'd won, not just in court, though that victory mattered, but in the larger battle for her own identity, her own worth, her own future. The phone rang again. Sarah from the bookstore. I saw in the news about the LA case. You're deploying the foundation team? Already in motion, I confirmed. We'll have people on the ground by tomorrow. You're amazing, you know that? 2 years ago, you were shelving books in my store. Now you're saving children from the same nightmare you survived. I had help, I reminded her. Grandfather, Patricia, Detective Rivera, even Victoria eventually. Nobody survives this kind of betrayal alone. But you did the work. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. You fought when fighting meant facing the people who raised you. That took courage most people don't have. After we hung up, I thought about her words. Courage. I'd never thought of myself as courageous during those dark months of investigation and trials. I'd just been doing what needed to be done, what justice demanded, what my parents deserved. But maybe that was what courage was. Not fearlessness, but doing what was right even when you were terrified. Fighting for truth even when everyone was telling you to stay quiet. Standing up for yourself when the world had trained you to stay small. I'd learned that inheritance came in many forms. Money and property, yes, but also trauma, resilience, strength, purpose. The question wasn't what you inherited, but what you did with it. Whether you let it define you or whether you used it to build something better. Melissa and Richard had given me an inheritance of betrayal and trauma, but my parents had given me something stronger. The foundation, literally and figuratively, to transform that darkness into light, to take the worst things that happened to me and use them to prevent those same things from happening to others. That 13-year-old girl in Los Angeles would get her inheritance back. She'd get justice. She'd get support from people who understood what she was going through because they'd been through it themselves. And maybe, someday, she'd use that experience to help someone else. That was true inheritance, not what was taken from you, but what you chose to pass forward. As I headed to the foundation office for the emergency meeting, my phone lit up with messages from team members already researching the LA case, preparing legal strategies, reaching out to local authorities. This was what we did. This was who we'd become. The basement that was supposed to be my prison had become my art studio. The inheritance they'd tried to steal had become a foundation that changed lives. The trauma they'd inflicted had been transformed into purpose that gave meaning to every day. They'd locked me in darkness, hoping I'd disappear. Instead, I'd found the evidence that destroyed them, built a life that honored my parents, and created a legacy that would protect children long after I was gone. That was the ultimate revenge, though revenge felt like the wrong word. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about building something so much better than what they'd tried to take from me that their cruelty became irrelevant. Melissa and Richard Hayes had taught me what family shouldn't be. My parents, even in death, had shown me what family should be. Grandfather had demonstrated what protection looked like. Patricia had proved that justice was possible, and every child we helped through the foundation reminded me why all of this mattered. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who tried to diminish you? How did you find the strength to reclaim your power? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, you are never as powerless as someone tries to make you believe. Your worth isn't determined by those who failed to see it. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is the strength you discover when everything is taken away.